Hello, everyone. Hi there, everyone. We are about to get started. So this is the very last presentation of our conference. Are you guys sad? I'm a little bit sad. Yeah. So sad and happy. It's bittersweet. But thank you everyone who has stayed for this last presentation, because I think it's really going to be very interesting. The presenter and I, Gina Sapiro, we're talking about how this is not supposed to be any type of depressing note that we're ending this conference on. This is just what's happening out there in the higher education landscape. And it's just important that we talk about the shifting changes that we're experiencing as institutions. We have several, institutions here in Vermont that may be going through some type of shift. Many of your home states are experiencing this as well as many other higher education institutions across the country. And so if we just embrace this and talk about it and maybe figure out how we can be part of the process, then we can do the work. We know we can. We always put our heads down and, power through. So I just want to thank everyone again for staying, and also to note that as we wrap up this presentation, there will be boxed lunches that will be put out for everyone to grab on their way out. If I got in touch with you about specifically your dietary needs, your box lunch will be labeled with your name on it. And if you don't see that, please let me know, because I want to make sure everybody is able to grab some food on their way out. So our keynote address speaker today, Virginia Gina Sapiro, is a professor emerita of political science and a dean emerita of arts and sciences at Boston University. She has published extensively in the fields of political psychology, political behavior, and public opinion, and gender politics, and feminist and democratic theory. Her scholarship is a study of the history of higher education in the United States and its relationship to the American political and social development. So I'm very excited about this presentation. I get to see these presentations before they actually get done because I get them to my email. So I looked through it. I like it. I'm very excited. So I hope you all are as well. So Gina, I will introduce you.
So you mean I don't have to go home yet, huh? Thank you, everybody, for staying. I never know what to expect if you end up in the last session. Just so I know who's here and a little bit warm up, could you do a lightning round, go around the room and tell me what institutions you're from, just quickly around the room? Go table, table, table like that. Shout it out. You guys can decide who's next. A lot of UMass Amherst here. Cool. Yay. My alma mater. Nice. I didn't mean yay just to Clark, really. Yay to everybody else too. It's just, this is my 50th reunion year at Clark, so come on. So thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. I was telling somebody earlier that transfer issues are actually near and dear to my heart. When I was vice provost for teaching and learning at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one of the things that I did was organized a study of the transfer student experience at Madison. And I didn't know anybody else who had done that at that point, it was a long time ago. And so we did a whole lot of data research, did a lot of focus groups, did a lot of surveying, all sorts of things. And it was really fascinating because, as some of you may know, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, though a public and a flagship, is much more selective than it wishes to be, and much more exclusive than it wishes to be, as some of the other major flagships are, because there's so much pressure on enrollment. And we actually had a lot of transfer students of a couple of different sorts. One were the folks coming in from community colleges. The second were the folks coming in from the comprehensives. And the third were the people who thought they were very brave and went to big Eastern schools, or she Eastern schools, and then decided they needed to get back to their mummies and daddies and came back to Madison. And I can tell you that one of the clearest things we learned, that the best prepared students for transferring into Madison were the community college students. And they were the community college students because the people they worked with at those institutions were hyper conscious that one of the signs of success was if they could get the students who wanted 4-year degrees into Madison. And so they worked super hard with Madison, and Madison worked hard with them to work together to figure out how to make that happen. The students who were least prepared to come back to Madison were the folks who went to the other elite institutions. For all sorts of reasons you can imagine. You can probably imagine who those students were who decided to go off and then decided they couldn't be very far away from home. They didn't lose those problems when they came home to Madison. Trust me. In any case, what I did after that, when I became interim provost, was to really push for more articulation agreements, especially with the community and tribal schools in Wisconsin, which was good for them and good for us because it could help diversify the Madison campus. And also with the comprehensives, though it was a little harder to do it with them because they weren't very interested in having their students transfer to Madison for very obvious reasons. So I learned a lot very deeply then. And I also learned a lot about the people who work with transfer process, transfer students, and all of that. So kudos to you. So you've all seen the stories and probably have felt the shockwave of fear that swept higher education in recent years. Since 2015, more than 50 nonprofit institutions of higher education accredited at the baccalaureate level or above have closed, either outright or as a result of merger. And you can see some of the names here, a couple this year, a few last year. And by the time you get to the couple of years before then, yes, I know those fonts are too small for you to read. And that's the point, is we're losing a lot every year. The institutions range across the country, but the list is especially long in New England for some reasons we will talk about. Becker College, Pine Manor College, Wheelock College, Southern Vermont College, Marlborough College, Green Mountain College, the College of St. Joseph, Newbury College, Linden State College, Johnson State College, the National Graduate School of Quality Management, Mount Ida College, Atlantic Union College, Lincoln College of New England, Burlington College, Daniel Webster College, the Boston Conservatory, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Marion Court College, 19 colleges in New England alone, just over the very past few years. Some of you didn't realize the list was that long, and it is. So, and this is not going to be the end either here in New England or across the country. Across the country, vulnerable colleges and universities are facing their death knells, steadily declining enrollments, some institutions as high as 50% over their recent 10 years. And many institutions are taking the kinds of major steps typical of those whose viability is threatened. Of course, the COVID pandemic exacerbated the problem, hastening decline in already vulnerable institutions. Now, this epidemic of colleges and university closings is a serious problem for many constituencies. Closures are most obviously disruptive to current students' educational progress and their lives. Students and their families experience the closures as a breach of promise. Most of the closures affect small institutions, ones with very particular or unusual missions, and those that are relatively non-selective and low in prestige rankings, making it very difficult for the students who are left behind to find alternatives. Students at those institutions often come from families that are not very knowledgeable about higher education institutions and processes, or frankly, they may not have been at those colleges in the first place. Closures, even if accomplished through mergers, necessarily create unemployment, perhaps long-term unemployment for faculty and staff, and the loss of pensions and other benefits on which they depended. When an institution of higher learning ceases to exist, it affects alumni in many ways. And when a higher education institution closes, it hurts a wide range of businesses in the surrounding neighborhoods and local communities that depended on the students, the faculty, and the staff for their clientele. Housing markets are disrupted. Buildings and campuses that often include historic and white elephant structures have to be repurposed, and that's expensive. Colleges and universities are social and cultural landmarks that are important parts of a neighborhood or a local community's identity. The loss of institutions of higher learning is a very serious matter. It's natural then that the wave of recent closures has created shockwaves, but it has also been widely treated as though this is an unusual phenomenon caused by something very particular to this era. Today, I want to put these closures into a wider perspective, drawn from a historical perspective, to understand them and help us think about how to think about them. I'm going to place what we're seeing into a framework emphasizing the life course of higher education institutions and the ecology of higher education. Now, you all know what a life course is with respect to people. We can also understand social institutions through the same concept. The life course of higher education institutions refers to the stages, normal opportunities and challenges, and institutional strategies and tactics that are typical of them during their individual histories. Colleges and universities are founded, often, in fact, usually, as transformations of previous institutions, and almost always face significant vulnerabilities to reach a level of sustainability. They all have phases of growth, development, and change in their missions and operations. And many, more than you know, experience periods of mortal vulnerability, sometimes succumbing. It's sometimes hard for those of us inside of higher education to see the larger patterns because our own institutions work so hard to brand them by emphasizing how very unique each of our own institutions is. Frankly, they're often making claims at uniqueness with more than a little exaggeration. Institutions' life courses are not independent of their social, political, and economic environments. The historical and social context of an era shapes the opportunities that are open to them, the constraints and the crises that hit them. The particularities of individual institutions certainly determine how the historical and social context hits them, how vulnerable they are to being hurt, how readily they are to take advantage of opportunities, and whether they have the leadership to act creatively, strategically, tactically. But if we're interested in more than just the fate of particular institutions, then understanding those institutions as part of an ecology of higher education is important. And by ecology of higher education, I mean the linkages not just among higher education institutions, but of the entire sector to the other social, political, and economic institutions and forces that surround them. This ecology of higher education is what has preoccupied me in my research on the history of higher ed in America. I've been investigating this history through the collective story of the set of colleges and universities that were ever accredited to offer baccalaureate or graduate degrees, about 4,000 institutions in total. In the 20th century, regional accreditation became the gold standard of certification that an institution meets appropriate standards of academic quality, financial stability and viability, and appropriate governance practices. I can answer questions later about what kind of institutions are excluded from this research and what's included. Let me start with a few brief comments on the founding of higher education institutions before we talk about how they close. A very large proportion of America's colleges and universities were founded as tiny institutions in frontier towns between the earliest European settlements on this continent up to the Civil War. They were often founded within a few years of the establishment of the settlements themselves, well before the existence of high schools, often before there were many or any students qualified to pursue a degree. But these communities were usually settled by people of a common religious denomination, seeking to establish and preserve their spiritual life and cultures, and they needed preachers and teachers to do that. And so, beginning with Harvard College, or New College, as it was called, in 1636, they founded these new colleges and for some years ran them mainly as prep college programs, and that includes Harvard. The founding of colleges was shaped by the migrations and settlements across the country, by changes in technology and transportation, by shifting economic needs of this nation, the impact of wars and other major events, and eventually by the impact of massive urbanization. A very large proportion of today's colleges and universities have evolved and were sometimes radically transformed from earlier institutions that were not colleges or universities at all, as we understand them today. Lots started out as a little theological seminary, like BU, or a secretarial school, or a hospital, or an art museum, or a YMCA night school, like Northeastern, or the effort of one guy who took on some apprentices and students, and eventually turned into a little school, and eventually turned into a bigger school, and eventually turned into a college, or even a major university. But be aware, only a tiny proportion of Americans went to college at all before World War II. Not until the mid-1960s, I think I have something on this. Yes. Not until the mid-1960s was even 10% of the American population college educated. But the demand for seats exploded after World War II for many reasons. The GI Bill, the baby boom, increasing acceptance of the half of the population for whom higher education was not accepted previously, namely women, and the painfully slow decline of the exclusion of African Americans from higher education. So existing baccalaureate institutions expanded their capacity massively. Scores of institutions that had not previously offered baccalaureate programs became degree-granting institutions, and public and private entities founded new colleges and universities by the scores. It was a boom time based on demographic change after World War II. So let's look at the other end of the institutional life course. Colleges and universities do not suddenly blow up. None of them have suddenly blown up. Even when they literally burn to the ground overnight, as scores have in their histories, and sometimes more than once, most find a means to carry on. Their trustees, leaders, faculty, and other constituencies are committed to them and usually do everything they can to keep them alive, even when their enrollment is declining and they face increasing debt. In fact, history of most colleges have spent most significant parts of their institutional existence teetering on the brink of financial ruin. Although if we look at our institutional history of our own institutions, they don't tell us that. Even Harvard failed within a few years of its founding and had to close for a year. This was super common. To understand, start with this fact: virtually no college or university has ever lived off tuition dollars alone. They can't. In the 18th and 19th century, they used donations, gifts, community, and public support. This is even true for institutions now recognized as private. Scholarship subscriptions, public land grants, and sponsorship by religious denominations, or the creation of revenue-producing enterprises. Should I bash Harvard again? Okay. Why is it so rich? It's because the Massachusetts Bay Colony gave that little college all of the proceeds from the ferry that went across the Charles River, and then gave it all the proceeds from the bridge that went over the Charles River, and then gave it a whole bunch of land. And their public donations didn't end until late in the 18th century. So private, doing it just on their own? Sorry, no. But institutions also fail because the regional population, especially the population of so-called college-age people, declines or doesn't grow as expected. As transfer experts, you probably know that most students do not travel very far from home to go to college. They still don't travel very far from home to go to college. Even today, the median distance from home for students at public four-year colleges is 18 miles. And the median distance for students at private, nonprofit, four-year colleges is 46 miles. Imagine back in the old days when there weren't highways and cars and planes. Throughout American history, settlement declines occurred with great regularity because of the opening or closing of railroad lines, or the search for better conditions for agriculture, or the flight into the cities, or many, many other disruptions. These shifts in local conditions could and did kill colleges regularly. You know the demographic story of today. Colleges grew and flourished because of the post-World War II baby boom and the other factors that I talked about, and were sometimes sustained by baby boom echo and the increasing expectation that young people should go to college to succeed. But that's over. And we've all known for quite a while that that is over. We've reached the demographic cliff. The number of people of so-called college age has declined and will continue to decline. The expectation that young people should get a college education may not decline as much as some people think, but it will not grow sufficiently again to counteract that demographic cliff. All this while the basic cost, and I mean the cost, not the price of education, will continue to rise as it has for some time. And we need to think about the difference between the cost of education and the price of education, because as we all know, no matter what people say about how high the price is, the price at most places does not cover the cost. The bust, of course, will be bigger in some areas than others, and already has been, by the simple fact of where the population is rising or is falling. And states and regions that optimistically grew lots of small and niche colleges, like Vermont, earlier in their histories, will witness more failures than most other states. When colleges and universities fail, something has usually pushed a long vulnerable institution over the cliff, usually debt that has become unsustainable to the institution itself, or where relevant to a parent organization such as a religious denomination, the diocese. The core problem, more often than not, is that students and their parents are voting with their feet. They are not enrolling, and at some point, this becomes a downward spiral. Colleges and universities have used myriad strategies and tactics as they begin to spiral to try to avoid that disaster. In the 19th century, some required students or faculty to contribute labor to maintenance and day-to-day operations, very common in the pre-Civil War period. It was students and faculty who would go cut the wood, who would raise the animals, who would grow the crops that they would use at the colleges, who would do the maintenance. In our time, or that they would often cut the pay or even go without paying faculty, and that happened regularly up through the Depression. In our time, it seems clear that many of the smaller, poorer institutions don't have the professional staff or leadership to steer an endangered institution away from disaster. A lot of our institutions essentially have amateurs running the financial and strategic operations of a complicated, even if small, institution. Some, it seems, mostly use the salve of optimism and loyalty to their great traditions and distinctive mission. That doesn't solve the spiral. Among the many techniques institutions now use to try to right themselves financially are these. They reduce the number of faculty and/or staff. They cut programs or majors. They launch new programs that might attract new students or full fee-paying students. They find new constituencies to boost enrollment, such as lay people in the case of religious institutions, students of other denominations in the case of faith-based institutions, students of a gender or race not previously welcomed. You think they did that because they're open-hearted about equality? Foreign students, students of non-normative ages, including both prep students and working adult students or less qualified students. They welcome transfer students when they used to be less receptive to them. They build housing or create distance programs to attract students from further afield. They launch a variety of types of fundraising efforts, including philanthropy and revenue producing programs and functions. They eat their seed corn by increasing spending of their precious little endowment funds for operations and debt coverage. They pursue governmental programs that provide funding. They defer needed maintenance. They sell infrastructure and other resources. They build infrastructure that might attract new students. They seek adoption by an organization that can provide additional support, such as a denomination, the public sector, or a corporation. They move the institution to a better location or try to improve the environment of the institution, as happened in the urban planning period of the 1950s and 1960s, usually without great success. They try to make themselves seem fancier by changing their name from college to university. Some of you have probably experienced some of these. Some of these strategies are more obviously designed for short-term amelioration than long-term success. Some are almost certainly counterproductive in the longer term, like eating your seed corn. Almost all of these strategies require further investments during a time of failing resources, sometimes substantial investments. These often are Hail Marys. Many contain hidden and not so hidden costs that require further expenditures, such as those that think they're going to save a lot of money by going to online programs, which cost a lot as you roll them out. Most of these tactics usually make vulnerable institutions more, not less vulnerable in either the short or the long term. And the existence of accreditation bodies makes these vulnerabilities more visible to those who know how to look, because that's what the accreditation bodies are looking for, even down to bad governance. But there are institutions that have turned their situation around. It takes a lot more than saving paper clips or eliminating some majors. And in most cases, tightening belts won't work. But we look at Arizona State, for example, or Southern New Hampshire, which did some amazing things. It takes brave and decisive but affordable action that is visible and attractive to students and funding sources. And remember, it has to be visible to the students and funders, because what we're talking about is students and parents voting with their feet. And so you got to get their feet moving to your institution. So let's look once again at the pattern of college and university closures over time. And let me be clear here, I use the term closure as a short term for both closing narrowly construed, even when the institution and its programs go out of existence entirely, and for cases in which the institution's programs may continue under the aegis of another institution because of mergers, but the college or university no longer exists as an independent, self-governing institution with fiduciary responsibility for itself or control over its future. Now, in the history of higher education, institutions over the past 2 centuries or so, there have been very few years, actually, in which none of them were closed. Let's look here at the period from 1890 to the present. All you have to do is see you don't have to look at the little dots and wiggles, just look at the trend. Here you see the number of closures of higher ed institutions that were accredited at the 4-year or graduate level in 5-year increments. So it's already a little bit smoothed. And then you see a line that's the line through the middle that smooths it all on the average, so you can see the general trend. A small number of institutions of higher learning lose their independent existence almost every year. In fact, since 1890, all but 6 years, we saw closures of institutions. There were an average of about 3.5 closures per year over the entire time period. But as you see, there's generally a rising period of closures in the first quarter of the 20th century with 3 distinct peaks. One, not surprisingly at all, is in the early years of the Depression. Well, duh, that's a technical term. The second is a paired set in the 1950s and especially the late 1960s. I thought that was a period of growth. How come it was a period of closure? Well, there were a few cases of institutional churn that made a big difference. The end of race-segregated college campuses. A lot of that peak is driven by good old Florida, which when it founded community colleges and local colleges, founded 2 sets of them because it was an apartheid state. So in every one of the, whatever it was, 12 or 15 communities in which they founded colleges, they had to found 2 because you couldn't have Black and white students together. And so finally, when they had to end the apartheid system, they closed a number of colleges by merging. There was also in that period the end of many independent medical schools. A lot of medical schools used to be standalone. And for a whole variety of reasons, that began to end in the 1960s, 70s. That was the end of that period where most of the viable medical schools merged into universities. And there were also the creation of some higher ed systems that rearranged college existence. So there's tremendous churn in that period with lots of closures. The current and steepest rise in institutional closures was the result of a triple whammy. And is the result, it's continuing. First came the profound economic recession of 2008, which like the Depression, pushed a number of institutions over the edge, just as all the previous recessions. And I'm not showing you, 1876 and 1889 and all that, but every one of them caused closures. And so it did that. Second was the beginning of the demographic cliff, which is reducing the number of so-called college-age students in the country, and especially in the states and regions that are declining in population or not rising as much as, for example, in the Southwest. And finally, as you are overwhelmingly aware, since 2020, we're witnessing the impact of COVID on institutions that were already vulnerable because of their finances and enrollment. The number of closures we're witnessing now is unprecedented, as everybody said, but the underlying causes are not. To understand what's going on in our university system, if we take the longer look, it's very clear what's going on. It's to a great degree predictable. COVID wasn't, but once COVID happens, we should have known what the impact would be. And the rate of closures right now is going to be staying high for all these reasons. And you've been told that a million times, I'm sure. But let's look at this question from the point of view of the life course of higher education institutions as a whole. Give me the next, there we go. Okay. So here what you see is the same graph you just saw. That's the bottom line, squished down. So you've seen that already. Those are the closures. And then the dotted line at the top is the opening of new institutions, the founding of institutions that were eventually accredited at the 4-year or graduate level. So you see, no, we're still there. So you see the pattern, right? Again, you can see the trend line in the green You can see the peaks and the valleys. So once again, smoothed over 5 years each, so it's not quite as bumpy and wiggly as it might be. You see 2 or 3 things. First of all, there was a massive growth in the number of degree granting education institutions from the late 19th century through the 1970s. Just kept going and going. The growth peaked a few times. First, at the turn into the 20th century, with the founding of large numbers of institutions that eventually were accredited. There were whole bunches of institutions that were founded because of the forces of essentially rapid urbanization across the country. And many of them didn't start out as colleges and universities, but they became then. The best example, normal schools, right? Massive expansion of normal schools in the late 19th and early 20th century that then in the 1920s, 30s were transformed into teachers' colleges, and then were transformed in the 1940s to state colleges, and then were later transformed into state universities, right? You know that story by looking at it. So this is what you're seeing here. The Depression and World War II period were hard on the founding of institutions for obvious reasons. Who's going to open a new institution then? There were a lot of new programs, but the Depression and World War II was not a time to be opening. The massive peak in the 1960s and early 70s is all my fault, of course. The baby boom effect. Second, you can see that as the baby boom moved past college age, institutional foundings trailed off to the lowest in what looks like forever. And it kind of is. And third, until the 1980s, college foundings far outnumbered college closures. Then the shakeout began, and it's continuing today. We can discuss some of the historical dynamics of that if you want during Q&A. There's a lot we can talk about. But looking at the historical pattern of foundings and closures should help us think a little bit differently about what's going on and what it means. You really see this shakeout, right? We had the boom, and now it's all shaking out with the end of the cliff and with the end of the response to what people thought would be this massive continued. Who thought everybody was going to keep having that many babies? Seriously, they didn't know women were going to go into the workforce. That did it. We will continue to see colleges closing at a steep rate. Moody's estimates that even before the pandemic, about 30% of colleges were operating at a deficit. Let me say that again. Moody's thinks that about 30% of colleges are operating at a deficit. Colleges don't just blow up. Many institutions are facing unsustainable declines in enrollment. They're mostly small schools that have lived close to the financial margin for a long time, mostly private schools that depend on tuition dollars, but which do not offer a quality or scope of program that attracts student demand. And it's all about student demand. You have to ask, when enrollment is declining to a threatening degree, why are students staying away and attending other institutions instead? Most of the failing institutions are just not being attractive to them. Many of those institutions, by the way, have become accredited as baccalaureate institutions only recently. And in the post-war period, many trying to save themselves from financial ruin in the first place by upgrading and becoming colleges and universities. So they've gone through a number of tracks of trying to stay alive, and it's not working. The most vulnerable institutions mostly can't afford to hire faculty who are very competitive on the academic market or staff. They are often in small and rural communities where it's difficult to attract and retain a stable faculty, or for that matter, enough local students to be sustainable, and they definitely don't draw nationally. And unlike many of the elite schools, they're not attractive enough to command the tuition dollars from wealthy students that allow them to cover some of the costs for the less well-off students. And they lack the endowment and other funds to cover scholarships. Some tout their qualities as a special niche, But some niches are too nichey to be sustainable financially. Much as their alumni, students, and faculty love them, they are not offering programs, experiences, and credentials that attract students willing and able to buy in. And despite the American prejudice in favor of private higher education, and that prejudice is very strong, there are alternatives in the public sector that offer better opportunities, at least if their state legislatures do not totally squeeze them off. That was a political announcement. The starving of public institutions is another story for another time. Let's conclude by taking a brief look at the afterlife of colleges and universities. How exactly do they die, and what happens to them later? In some cases, they just do close. The trustees reach a conclusion that the institution is unsustainable and they close, try to sell off the assets, and in the interim arrange a teach-out plan for the remaining students and find an institution to take over their archives. I'm sure a lot of you have been involved in those teach-out plans. In many of these cases, the trigger is that the accrediting agency puts them on probation or makes clear moves toward eliminating their degree accreditation, in which case they can't get scholarships for their students, in which case they're going to fail. In some cases, it's a higher authority that makes the decision. This is true in the case of denominational colleges that are closed by their larger religious body, such as the diocese, or the state institution closes them. In many cases, the trustees or authorities look for a partner that will allow the institution to continue in some fashion, or other institutions make an offer to a vulnerable institution. This can take many forms. The most common is that a larger and more sustainable institution acquires the failing one, often swallowing it whole and transforming it into a unit of the larger institution because they see some benefit to that. This happened to most of the independent professional schools in this country in the early 20th century. The independent law schools, med schools, business schools, art schools were all incorporated into universities as distinct but integrated departments and schools. Sometimes the continued existence of the failed school is more symbolic than real. It's a name on a building. These integration schemes are never easy, and they usually face a large amount of resistance. A good example of the process done well was the recent acquisition of Wheelock College by Boston University, and I'm not saying that because I'm biased. And perhaps we'll have to see how it works, the acquisition of Becker College by Clark University. Again, I'm not biased. The Wheelock case is very interesting because at first the trustees attempted to hire a new president for the very weak institution without telling the search firm or the candidates that the college was in such bad shape that they were beginning to look for merger partners. Great way of hiring a president. I know this because I had put my name in for that job, but removed myself from consideration when I looked at their financials. And I couldn't figure out how they were going to stay open. But then they turned around and brought on leadership that worked thoughtfully and carefully to find a partner, and one that would offer a good transition and a respectful match with protections for as many students, faculty, and staff as possible. That ended up being BU. And that was a very good match for Wheelock, which had a long tradition of leadership in child education and social work. And it was a very good match for BU, which needed help in those areas and really wanted those buildings. In fewer cases, two institutions merge in relatively equal fashion, perhaps submerging both identities into a newly created one. In a few cases, for-profit institutions have been eager to acquire failing nonprofits. They don't care about the programs, the faculty, the staff, the students, or the mission. Trust me. What they really want to acquire is the accreditation that the private institution has because it continues, and why? And therefore, they get the access to the public funding, such as Pell Grants, which is why a lot of so-called private for-profit institutions depend largely on government grants for their income. It's quite disgusting, really. Some closures end up very sadly and very problematic for faculty, staff, and mostly students. This is most likely when the institution did not face up to reality and hid the situation from their various constituencies as much as possible and as long as possible. That was the case of Mount Ida College in 2018. A lot of you will remember Mount Ida was actually only accredited to offer bachelor's degrees in 1984, though it was a much older institution. It had severe deferred maintenance problems, a history, long history of financial difficulties, and it suffered terrible enrollment declines, but it had pretty buildings. In the late spring of 2018, without warning to students, staff, or faculty, it announced it would close that spring. There was no teach-out plan. There was no preparation. It was a mess. It was the worst case I think any of us had ever heard of. Soon then, some of you may want to close your ears, UMass Amherst announced that it would acquire the campus, and UMass Dartmouth and Newbury College, which itself closed in 2019, would take on the Mount Ida students. Of course, the UMass Amherst acquisition caused its own stir because of the perceived competition with, yes, there is a UMass in Boston. Of course, the closures always feel sad to those engaged with the campus and to alumni. And as I said in the beginning, closures are disruptive and costly to many of the individuals involved and to the communities. But it strikes me as equally costly to keep trying to lure students, usually our most vulnerable students, to enroll in failing, often substandard institutions. But it is no surprise that a shakeout in higher education is occurring and more institutions will close. The question we're left with, and you may want to talk about, is how to serve the students of tomorrow with the thousands of institutions that will surely remain. Thank you. How much time we got?
We have about 13 minutes. So
You
if
have
anybody
13
wants to
minutes.
ask any questions, I can walk around the microphone.
Why don't I collect a few questions
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I can hear them and then respond? And
I know they're coming to me, but I
Yeah.
need a mic. I think I can project pretty well. So I actually wanted to comment on the inclusion of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, because I don't see that as really being the same, because all academic courses were all taught by Tufts faculty already, happen to be a graduate of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Tufts. And there's no closure of buildings. There might be a loss of a few administrative positions, but none of the faculty, none of the faculty is changing. None of the buildings are being closed. None of the students are being displaced. So all
So
the
why?
academic degrees were given by Tufts as well. School Museum of Fine Arts gave diplomas, but academic degrees came from Tufts going many years. So,
and that's why it ceased independent existence, because it didn't really exist in reality. So what I'm looking at is institutions founding and what happens when they cease independent degree granting status. So the case that you have at the MFA school is, in a way, it was phony as an independent status. And
it never granted.
because
Right.
by that point in its history, it wasn't. And that's different from, for example, the museum school of the Fine Arts Museum in Chicago and some of the others. They all went different ways. But that's a really good example where it is a closure. It's technically a closure in the sense of that institution is no longer accredited independently to give degrees. But does it make a ripple? Not really. Because it already wasn't acting like it was independent. That's the criteria. Is it an independent, self-governing, separately accredited institution? It was technically. I mean, all it shows, we're in the same page in the sense that all it shows is there was no reason for it to have that technical separate existence. And it hadn't changed a thing. It was fine for everybody.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that because it doesn't have.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
There was a school in Massachusetts that announced that it was looking at closing, and the alumni and students, the two kind of came together, rallied, fundraising.
Was it Hampshire or somewhere?
I don't know. I'm just wondering if that's like a Band-Aid or something that is on the wall or.
The question, in case you didn't hear it, is there's an unnamed school named Hampshire that that was going to close. One of my best friends in college went there, so was going to close, and of course, as usual, it always happens. The alumni, the faculty, the staff got up in arms, and they decided to keep going. I don't know whether that provoked anybody to give a big, huge gift, but the question is that a Band-Aid? I'd have to look at the financials to know. If there wasn't a big, huge gift, then yes, it's a Band-Aid. Maybe it has Mickey Mouse on it or something else, but it's a Band-Aid. Hampshire College is what Hampshire College was. It's a cute little liberal arts place that serves kind of out there young folk. It hasn't transformed itself, and I don't think that it received big bucks to be able to continue its operations. Sir.
What I think is interesting is how we're talking about here, it's a 4-year school, but all you have to do is just law school.
Yeah.
So it's not discussed, it's like working its way. You hope it doesn't work out.
So what I'm talking about is the institutions that are accredited independently, that are standalone institutions. Most of those professional schools, not all, but most of them folded into universities long ago. So what you're talking about is the qualities of programs, but not the issue of closures. And the law school component of a lot of universities, yes, are in trouble because we went through some years when students stopped going to law schools. It's rising again. I mean, look around you. And med schools likewise, although there are some independent schools. What you're talking about is something that is tied into the story, though, in this way. One of the ways that a lot of institutions are trying to save themselves from a death spiral, one of the kind of programs they institute is master's programs, because for reasons I can't imagine, other than delaying going out into the workforce, there are a lot of people who are willing to spend cash on the barrel to get a master's degree, including master's degrees that do not give you credentials for a particular job. And so most universities have really pushed expanding master's degrees because undergraduate education is a matter of trade-off between tuition by the wealthy students and Pell Grants and redistribution. We all know that, right? And doctoral programs, especially academic doctoral programs, a student should never go to a doctoral program where they have to pay each year. They need to have fellowships. The master's degree is pure income. And for a lot of universities, the master's degree is a cast-off where the faculty don't necessarily pay all that much attention. They bring in bunches of people and so forth. So while it's not on the point of programs that are independently accredited and might disappear, it is on the point of things that institutions do to try to save themselves. And master's programs are the major degree that are often used as cash cows. Especially. Yes. Yes. Well, master's degrees in professional fields are very important degrees. You know, the MSW, there are a whole bunch of, although increasingly they're inflating them to call, you know, the same program, doctoral programs. I saw that a lot when I was provost. But take master's programs in most of the liberal arts. My own field, political science, most major institutions shut down master's programs in political science ages ago. It doesn't get you anything. It's a cash cow. If you want to do politics, you go to public policy. A master's of public policy or public administration does something for you. A master's of political science or history, nada, right? They're cash cows. Tell your students, don't do it. More?
So lucky enough never to have had the responsibility of dealing with any, but when a board of trustees or a institutional leader is confronted with declining enrollments and financial risk, let them have a range of awful choices.
Yeah.
And hiding it is one option.
Yeah.
And declaring it is another, and trying to hide it from the accreditors
Won't work.
sounds awful, but they would worry that starts the spiral.
Right.
When they're placed on probation. So there are no good choices there.
Voila. The question is, institutions that have the wherewithal to hire a lot of really top-notch professional staff, and it's super competitive, know how to look long in advance. So a lot of institutions started looking at the demographic cliff. I mean, I remember we were talking about that at Wisconsin 25 years ago. It was obvious. And institutions don't turn around on a dime. So you had to start thinking about, what do you do? Where do you expand? What do you do incrementally so you don't scare the bejesus out of everybody on and off campus, and so that you don't wait until you're circling the drain, right? And so if it's becoming really obvious, there aren't really a lot of good choices. But again, I mean, I'm talking mostly about those institutions accredited at the 4-year and graduate degree. There are a lot of community colleges that did fabulous things because they were really beginning to look at who they serve, what would bring feet in, what were the rising technologies, what were the connections to be made, not just with universities, but with employers. How do you do that? How do you transform curriculum by not getting rid of English and history, but making a connection that helps students understand how they can use that, let's say, the liberal arts core, which they need for their later life, how to adapt that to a workforce. And so I think actually there are a lot of community colleges that have been very, very adept at doing that over time. And they're serving a very clear, most are serving a really clear population. They know who their populations are. And some colleges and universities have done that. But most of those vulnerable ones have been vulnerable for most of their careers. And, I hate to say it as somebody who loves the higher education sector. I've spent nearly half a century at it, and now I'm spending my time studying it. So I love that sector. But it is also a business, and we expanded massively. And so that's why my final question is, what do we do for the students above the institutions? Because we will have this shakeout, and how do we take care of the various students? And when I see students whose parents, they're first gen, maybe immigrants, the parents don't know anything about the higher education sector. Take Mount Ida, they used to show beautiful pictures. I mean, it's gorgeous. It was owned by a rich people, beautiful, beautiful buildings. I've been to conferences there. Show them gorgeous buildings and say, this is where you can go to college. I don't think it's so good for us to be doing that to our students, not today when they're so vulnerable. I think we hit our 13 minutes. I'll hang around a couple of minutes. Enjoy your sandwiches. Thank you for letting me speak with you.